Guys, so we're going to talk about something called the square root property. You guys already know it, believe me when I say that, so I don't think this is going to be terribly difficult for you. So we're going to just look at several examples as to how we can use the square root property to solve quadratic equations. So let's take a look. Here's the formal definition of the square root property. You guys already know this, believe me when I say. So basically what it says is if b is a real number and if a squared equals b, then a equals plus or minus the square root of b. So what this is saying is if we have some term being squared, so let's say maybe we have x being squared here, okay, as long as it's isolated, okay, the x, whatever term is being squared is isolated on one side and everything else is on the other, okay, then all we have to do is we can use the square root property, right? We can take the square root of both sides. We know that a square root cancels out a square, but when we do that, we have to consider both the positive and negative cases of our number, okay, of our b term, our number term. So when we take that square root of 9, we have to consider, okay, it could be a positive 3 or it could be negative 3, right? Because we know that positive 3 squared equals 9, but we also know that negative 3 squared equals 9. Okay, we have to deal with either case, right? We've been dealing with mostly the principal square roots. When you use the square root property, you have to consider both the positive and negative cases here. So let's take a look at how we can use this. So here we have use the square root property to solve x squared equals 50. Okay, this is already set up. Our term that's being squared is on one side, our number is on the other. This is set up beautifully for the square root property. So if I have x squared equals 50, I know all I need to do is take that square root to isolate the x, right? The square root is going to cancel out the square. So x equals, and then remember, whenever I use the square root property, the caveat is you have to consider both the positive and negative cases of the number, the root of that number. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 50. Now we know we can simplify this a little bit. So I need to factor 50. So I know 5 times 10 is 50, 5 is prime. 10 is not, so 5 times 2, that gives me 10. Both of these are prime, so I've fully factored this. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 50. I'm going to rewrite that as x equals plus or minus the square root of 5 times 2. My index is 2 here, so I can pull out pairs of numbers. My 5 is going to come out. I don't have a buddy to go with my 2 here, so my 2 has to stay under the radicand. So this will simplify down to x equals plus or minus 5 square roots of 2. So the square root property, again, really nice. All right, let's look at this next example. It says, use the square root property to solve 2x squared minus 14 equals 0. Now, guys, sometimes, when you're just doing an assignment or a test, or maybe you'll be doing the final, there's lots of ways you can solve this. You don't have to use the square root property, right? We could try and factor it, use the principle of zero products, and solve for x. We're going to learn how to use the quadratic formula to solve something like this, but you might recognize that, oh, the square root property would work really well here. So if you recognize it, use it. So when we use the square root property, right, we know we need to isolate our x squared, okay, so that we can just simply take the square root. So if we need to isolate our x squared, we need to get everything else to the other side. Okay, first I'm going to move that 14 over by adding 14 to both sides. This will cancel, so I'm left with 2x squared equals 14. I'm still trying to isolate my x squared, so I need to get rid of that 2. So divide both sides by 2, that gives me x squared equals 7. And now that I've got my x squared isolated, now I can take that square root. I can use the square root property. The square root is going to cancel out the square, so I'm left with x. And I know anytime I use the square root property, I have to consider both the positive and negative cases. The square root of 7 is as simplified as it's going to get because 7 is a prime number. And just as a quick side note, sometimes you'll see the solutions written like this, x equals plus or minus the square root of 7. Sometimes on your homework or in your book, it will write the solution in brackets. So it will take that plus or minus 7 and separate them out. So negative square root of 7, comma, positive square root of 7. So if you see that on your homework, it's just another way to write the solution, okay? I can either write plus or minus the square root of 7, or I can list them out separately in brackets. So x equals either negative square root of 7 or positive square root of 7. All right, here's our last example. Use the square root property to solve quantity x plus 1 squared equals 12. What's really nice about this one is our term that's being squared is already isolated, right? Our x plus 1 squared, our term that's being squared, is the only thing on the left side of the equation. So we can just jump right to that square root property. Okay, I know that a square root cancels a square. So I've got x plus 1 on my left side. I know that when I use the square root property, I have to consider both the positive and negative cases of that root. So I've got x plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 12. I'm trying to isolate x, so I've got to get rid of this 1. So I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. My 1 goes away here. So I'm left with x equals plus or minus the square root of 12 minus 1. Now we know that we can definitely simplify this, or at least try to simplify this a little bit. So why don't you pause the video, factor 12, and pull out any pairs of numbers from underneath that square root. So hopefully you actually did pause the video and factor this out and simplify it underneath the radical. Okay, when we do, you should get x equals plus or minus 2 square roots of 3 minus 1. Okay, and so we can go even a little bit further than this and write it really nicely. X equals negative 1 plus or minus 2 square roots of 3. Okay, so please let me know if you have any questions, but the biggest thing to remember is when you're using the square root property, whatever term is being squared, you want to isolate it. And when you take the square root of both sides, you need to remember to consider it both the positive and negative cases.